And the honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I always begin, over the last 10 years, to always say what an honour it is to rise in this institution. I am very honoured to represent the people of Timmins, James Bay. But I'm not very proud of what I see in this Parliament. And I'm not proud to see that the role of the Parliament of Canada continually is turned into an exercise where we're the marionettes of some kind of dumbed-down political show. And when we see the use of time allocation again and again to limit debate, when we see how the monkey-wrenching of committees, where reports are written by the government and basically brought forward, ignoring all manner of amendments, where the committees traditionally, when I was first elected, Mr. Speaker, the committees, as a general rule, tended to work together. I see the attack, the relentless attack on the independent bodies whose job it is to give us the information we need, whether it's Statistics Canada, whether it's researchers. I see the vicious attack by the leaders in this government against the offices of Parliament, whose job it is to maintain the integrity of the electoral system of Canada, and the absolute shameful attack on Mr. Mayrand by the so-called Minister for Democratic Reform. I think that this election fraud that is being perpetrated in this House with this Act, and the complete ignoring of every single expert, makes everything that's happening in this Parliament in 2014 a very unfunny joke. When the Prime Minister can stand up and not be able to name a single witness, credible witness, but yet attack personally him and his gang, the witnesses who represent democratic integrity in this country, it's a shameful situation, Mr. Speaker. And so we have an omnibus legislation that is being pushed through in this Potemkin Parliament. And we'll all get up and we'll stand at the end of the day and the Conservatives will say democracy was heard. But what's not being heard, Mr. Speaker, is the analysis we need on the temporary foreign worker program, on the hazardous materials, on railway safety, on the fact that now on the Champlain Bridge in Montreal, people are going to have to pay to go to work. And, Mr. Speaker, on page 99 of this bill, the fact that this government has signed a secret deal with the United States to share the personal data of tens of thousands of Canadians. Canadians should look to Parliament to say that citizenship is something that is sacred, that is something that the role of parliamentarians will stand up and defend the citizenship of Canadians. And yet in this omnibus legislation that's being pushed through, Mr. Speaker, in this attempt to shut down debate, they've just decided to slip in the bill that will now make it possible and legal for the United States government to demand the personal financial information of Canadians who have lived their lives in this country, who pay taxes in this country, who have been excellent citizens in this country, all because they happen to have been born in the United States. Now, is this the case of people who just come over and have moved over here a few years ago and don't want to pay tax? No, Mr. Speaker. I'll give you a few examples. In 1958, a family had to go to the hospital, and the child was born in the hospital on the U.S. side of the border. And now this person in their 50s finds that their personal financial information is subject to whatever the United States government wants to do with it. We see the case of a young woman who went to university in the United States almost a half-century ago and had a baby. And a year later, she returned to Canada, and that baby grew up as a Canadian citizen. That baby paid taxes, and that baby is a proud Canadian citizen. And she looks to this government and finds out this government doesn't consider her a Canadian citizen. If the Americans want the information on her personal private information, they will give it. I see, Mr. Speaker, an 80-year-old woman who called me, who spent the last half-century raising her children in Canada. And she's now being told that her life insurance that she saved up that is to be for her children can be handed over. And what protection did this government bring forward when they negotiated the IGA, which is the intergovernmental agreement that allows this FATCA, which is the Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act? Well, we don't know what they agreed to because they're pushing it through, Mr. Speaker. They're pushing it through without the scrutiny that belongs in this Parliament. And so what we're seeing is that they're saying, well, this will be compliant under the Privacy Act. But we see major, major problems with this because the United States government don't see themselves to have any of the same commitments that the Privacy Act in PAPETA is supposed to have to protect the personal information of Canadian citizens. For example, under the Canadian Privacy Act, financial institutions who collect personal information must only collect it for the purposes that they were collected. The United States, they haven't made any of those commitments. Under the Privacy Act, we have businesses that develop systems, including technology systems and protocols, including the use of encryption. They have to use it to protect the data against outside scrutiny. We have no idea how this data will be used when it's handed over to the United States. That under Principle 1, Schedule 1 of PAPETA, it encourages the accountability by mandating data collector responsibility for the personal information of a data subject. And the person has to be responsible. Well, there's no such provisions that we know of that were negotiated when the United States decided that they would come knocking on this compliant little government here and they would say, we want to be able to gather information on any Canadian we want, and you're going to give it to us? And this government said, okay, we will. We'll just run it through omnibus legislation. Finally, Principle 10 of Schedule 1 of PAPETA declares that an individual may bring a challenge to the organization that has their financial information if it's being misused. But none of those provisions exist as far as we know under the agreement that was signed. And the reason we don't know, Mr. Speaker, is because we're not allowed as the parliamentarians to debate it, because they're going to push it through. I asked the honourable colleague from Nipissing, or from Renfrew earlier on about this, and she said we were making things up. It's obvious the Conservatives haven't even read their omnibus legislation because they're happy to play the role of the marionette. They're happy to stand up and read the dumbed-down talking points, Mr. Speaker, but it is a disgrace what has happened in the Parliament of this country. We see that in this Potemkin Parliament, we still have the features of parliamentary tradition. For example, it's perfectly okay for the government to come in and misrepresent, to be mendacious, to be malevolent with the facts. It's just unparliamentary to say they're doing so. So we are engaged in this little facade that we're all the honourable gentlemen and gentlewomen carrying on the business of this country, when time and time again legislation is being forced through without scrutiny. So for the Canadian citizens who served this country and raised their children and paid their taxes, they can look to this government and say, where were you to protect the basic notion of citizenship, to ensure that there were basic rules in place? Well, we don't know that there are any rules in place because it will not be debated in Parliament. I think that, Mr. Speaker, is a very shameful day for our so-called democratic system that we've allowed in this Parliament to be so incredibly debased. But we see that time and time again in the way that the time allocations are being used, on the use of omnibus legislation that has nothing to do with the role of budget implementation. We do remember, and Canadians remember, that it was the omnibus legislation that stripped the water and lake protection from 99.9% of the waters in this country to help expedite pipeline expansion without any overview of the potential impacts on the various lakes and river systems of this country. They just threw it out, just like they threw out the researchers and the scientists who stood in their way, just like they attacked the parliamentary budget officer, Mr. Speaker. The parliamentary budget officer's role in this House of Commons was to provide parliamentarians with the credible knowledge. I am embarrassed to tell the Canadian people how little facts parliamentarians are given about the implementation of budgets. It is pushed through. Go to committee. Ask to have the minister come to committee and talk about the budget and how it's going to affect his departments. It ain't going to happen, Mr. Speaker, because they're protecting the front bench marionettes, and they do their job. But the role of this Parliament is to ensure that basic issues like the spending of taxpayers' money is given proper scrutiny, that international agreements that affect the rights of Canadian citizens are debated in this House, and that we ensure that our Canadian citizens are given the rule of law. But that's not happening here, Mr. Speaker. And so what we're going to see for the rest of the day is the pom-pom acts and the cheery faces of they read out their dumbed-down notes while avoiding every key aspect of legislative change that's happening in this massive omnibus bill, just like in the previous omnibus bill, just like the omnibus bill before that. And we're supposed to stand here and pretend that this falsehood is somehow a real parliamentary process. It is the Potemkin Parliament, and I think Canadian citizens need to know that this government is using the legislative process to ram through changes that fundamentally affect the rights of Canadians.
Question. Honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for bringing us back again to the egregious loss of democracy which has happened in this place. We tend to, as I said earlier today, speaking to C31, it's like Bruce Coburn's song, trouble with normal is it always gets worse. Every year we seem to accept less and less democracy. I ask my honourable colleague if he doesn't feel that we need to reverse these trends before we really lose democracy altogether.
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Well, I will respond with the lyrics of Bruce Coburn. Where is it? He said that they paid off the local bottom feeders, passing themselves off as leaders, kiss the ladies, shake hands with the fellows, and it's open for business like a cheap bordello, and they're calling it democracy.